Hi, this is Mark Montgomery. I'm founder and CEO of KYield. Wanted to do something a little bit different today and record a Zoom conversation with just me and go over an article that I recently wrote called The Top 10 Obstacles to Successful Enterprise AI. And this is, it went out in our newsletter and it's been published now. I shared it on LinkedIn, wrote it, pasted on LinkedIn, and then Lisa Wood at Cognitive World asked if she could publish it on Cognitive World. So it's up there now, and that's actually the nicest format if you want to take a look. It's linked from our website, KYield.com at the top. You can find it. So this is really important. It goes back to, essentially captures much of the 25 years experience in R&D in AI systems. And especially the last 10, 12 years, as we increase to engage with leading organizations, now numbering in the hundreds over the past 10, 12 years. Many of which were market leaders in the world's leading organizations, and in both public and private sector, although mostly in the private sector across all industries. So I wanted to run down these 10 obstacles and briefly. This picture, by the way, in the Zoom is I'm in my house today, and unfortunately, this is where I want to be. This is up on top of New Mexico, top of Wheeler Peak. We go up at least once a year, my wife Betsy and I, and we plan on, we'll be doing our annual trip up there and hike the end of the month. But it gives you an idea, one of the reasons why we stuck around here in New Mexico, came here from the Bay Area to mature R&D. And I was a frequent visitor at the Santa Fe Institute for several years. This is our favorite getaway in New Mexico, and you can see the Taos Ski Valley right down at the corner down there, about 13,100 feet or something like that. So let's get started here. The bad news is that the vast majority of companies, actually all organizations, are reporting a low ROI on their AI investments, if any. And most of the reports are like 80% around there. You'll see different surveys, but generally speaking, that's been the trend. Now, it's not all organizations though, and here's the problem for the majority, is that the small percentage, and it's not quite 20%, but let's call it 10% or less of the organizations, primarily startups and what's called superstars. But between the two, that represents a surprising amount of the total growth in revenue in our economy. So in other words, they're the ones eating most of the market share. And those are the ones that you need to worry about most in terms of competitors. They're entering new industries, enter new markets, and they are empowered with this very potent technology. So from a competitive standpoint, and this includes even market shares and industries, you need to be very concerned about this. Should be top priority. And I'll show a chart here in a few minutes, share a screen that's on the article about productivity growth, given my experiences engaging with all these leading organizations. So superstar firms are investing the most, but they're also wasting the most, which is an interesting trend. So they're wasting the most money. In some cases, they're not making an ROI yet, but they are increasing market share and revenue. And so it's this, historic concern about being Amazon is very valid when it comes to AI systems, especially enterprise-wide AI systems, which is what we focus on in our KOS. And so, the recent McKinsey Global Institute survey revealed that corporate managers are confident 3% of productivity growth is now sustainable for the broader economy. And by the way, there's a bunch of good links in this article, papers and articles. So for that alone, you should read it and check out the links. But I think you'll find even my part pretty interesting. We agree with that 3%. Actually, I think I think we can actually do better than that. But it is completely dependent on adopting systems. And so the quote at the top of this that you'll see at the Cognitive World is that my quote: "In order to remain competitive, companies need to rapidly transition from ML projects to refined enterprise AI systems." And that's really, to get to the sort of core argument in this, is that there's a lot of different obstacles to adoption of AI systems. But the basic problem is that ML projects are not competitive. They're highly redundant, they're inefficient. You need to do them, but they need to be done on refined systems. And I'm not talking about infrastructure here. I'm not talking about cloud infrastructure. I'm talking about AI systems for your specific organization. And so in our case, we focus on the universality, the universal issues every organization has. So our KOS provides governance and security and preventive capabilities and enhanced productivity tailored to each individual. And at the core of that, the patented core, is a data management system. And so the message that you're going to hear sort of over and over again in this and in other talks, and you're hearing it from others finally now too, amazing that it took this long, is that if you don't have a data management system in place that's pre-optimized for AI systems, it's physically impossible to compete. There's many functions that you physically cannot do unless, and this is a semi-automated system, right? And so for the whole enterprise, the workflow of your people. Now, that's not to say every program, but we can integrate with the most of the leading programs, and we can run on our system on top of essentially all the leading cloud providers, all the infrastructure providers. And so fortunately, that's not an issue. And the nice thing on the security kind of issue is that if one of your main cloud provider goes down, we can switch our system, KOS, very rapidly to a secondary cloud provider, or we can set it up with our own specialist data centers or the corporate customer corporate data center. And so you have redundancy. Now you hear about redundancy in this, that's the good kind of redundancy. So for security reasons, the bad part of redundancy is that there's an increasing amount of redundancy in the AI systems budgets. And we'll get into that. So let's get to it. Number one, the strong executive champions are rare. And it requires strong champions for AI systems, enterprise, especially enterprise-wide. The bottom line, what I mean by strong here, this is not meant to be a criticism, but my role here is to be a truth teller. I'm not here to waste anybody's time, including my own, by telling you everything is fine when it isn't. And you'll see that in the chart here in a second. Most organizations are in trouble, and they're not going to be able to compete unless they dramatically change their direction. So what I mean by strong is to have the willpower, the leadership. First you have to be interested in. You also have to have enough technical depth, not debt, depth, to be able to recognize competency. And this is a problem. It's a steep learning curve. It was for me 25 years ago. And I was already running a computer lab, and I was running networks, and we got into algorithmics and AI systems. I call it a knowledge systems lab, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. And there's only a handful in the world at the time. It's nothing like today. The largest was at Stanford. And there's very few of us. We're in a small private lab. That's where I conceived KYield. However, it's a steep learning curve. You're talking thousands of hours for very bright people to be able to even become competent terms of AI systems. Now you can right away, you can get open source if you've got your computer programs. This is what majority are doing. And you can get machine learning algorithms. And if you have a data set, you can be up and running. That's not AI systems. AI systems, by my definition, a lot of confusion on that, is that you have to have the internal data management system in place across the enterprise. If you don't have that in place, it's physically impossible to be competitive, to be able to do many of the functions. You can't do enterprise-wide prevention of crises, for example, unless you have a very smart data management system in place. It's not going to be efficient. It's not going to be economical, and you're not going to be able to provide security and enhanced productivity to each entity across the enterprise. And I don't know why it took so long. I think one of the reasons why it took so long for people to start talking about this is that, and by the way, that's our core patented system. and the reason is because I knew that 25 years ago. It seemed obvious. I think one of the reasons is that in all of the AI hype, the focus has been on algorithms. Even the media talks about running an algorithm. Well, running an algorithm is meaningless unless you have data to run it on. Now, there's some types that can create their own data, and our system creates data based on the workflow in a proprietary security, et cetera. But if you don't have the tailored, precision data that's accurate across the enterprise, then it doesn't matter how smart your algorithm is. It's garbage in, garbage out, same old story. So strong executive champions are really important. They're the only CEO is really who should lead this. And the reason is, and when I focus on, look at the organizations that are doing it well and are very successful, that's where it's occurring. Now, they're not computer scientists. You're talking about bankers and insurance leaders and manufacturers, retailers. But I can say that over the years, like in my newsletter, for example, it goes out in articles. I have hundreds of CEOs. Some of them have been following my work for over 10 years in their careers. They've had, some of them moved different companies. CX, the same is true with other CXOs. And you can see the pattern, those that have spent, 1,000 hours understanding this. And you can also see it in their strategies and their, how much they're embracing, investing in those sorts of things. So, but the CEO is the only one in the organization, typically, unless you have an executive chairman, that has the responsibility across the whole enterprise. So enterprise-wide systems, we're talking about every function across the organization, ecosystem, supply chain, R&D, finance, accounting, sales, every part of the organization. The data, in our case, our KOS, is tailored to each entity based on their own data. So it's in their own needs in a semi-automated manner. So that is really, really important. And it's not going to be a shocker to people who have been in the trenches internally or externally for years. Culture still eats strategy. So immediately those that are exposed to business as long as I have been are going to recognize this as part of a quote from Peter Drucker, or it's culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, there's good news and bad news about the cultures, right? A lot of cultures are focused on social issues today. That's good because they're doing some good work. They're being, more inclusive, more sustainable as companies, et cetera. However, the cultures that are resistant to change, heavily bureaucratic, very protective, those kinds of things, when it comes to adoption of technology, they can be fatal, even to a market leader. And you're seeing some of these changes take place, and it's one of those things where transformation is the right word, but the economy is transforming. And if the individual organizations don't keep pace and stay competitive, then they will have a lower, they'll move down on the economic ladder. And so, nationwide, statewide, city organizations, everything. So there's been an enormous effort to educate society on the AI science. There's also been a lot of hype. There's been many hard lessons learned, poor preparation, bad design, persistent myths, overhyped brands. However, most organizations have nonetheless become aware that you need advanced AI systems, and a very good one, to be able to compete. And so the fear that dominated 5 years ago about being displaced has been proven wrong. So we won that battle, thankfully. But now the primary battle is this, the projects internally, and a lot of pride, not invented here syndrome. We'll get to that in a second here. Number 3, confusing ML and DL projects with AI systems. Now this is the primary problem. Several years ago, all the consulting firms came out and said, look, you need to start small, you need to learn, hire a few people, and do these little experiments, do lots of little experiments. The problem is, and I recognized at the time, that's not what the leaders were doing. So I think this is probably a good point here to share my screen and show you this simple chart that I did here. And this is on top of the article at Cognitive World. Lisa Wood and her folks did a nice job with the format here. But on the left-hand side, this is a percent, so 100% improvement in productivity growth. And this is what I'm seeing. This is basically, from my perspective, what I'm seeing. We had several years ago, the investment started a long time ago, but you don't see in a lot of areas where the investment, let's say autonomous vehicles, they actually probably see a reduction in productivity growth because they're investing so heavily in autonomous vehicles. And it really isn't until that becomes commercialized that you're going to see the benefits. So that's an example of overall, the hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent. That's probably the biggest single item. And so you didn't see a lot of productivity growth, but then a couple of years ago, a lot of these smaller things that were system-wide, sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, started to show up. And then those organizations that were very well prepped, and they're primarily on the data management side, when the pandemic hit, they were in the best position to take advantage of it. I'm obviously not talking about tourism, airlines, those that were closed, lockdowns, but the the retailers, the supply chains, the vast majority that were considered essential and kept open. We had a phenomenon last year that's never happened, to my awareness, at any time in history. I guess the only time that would probably come close would be revenue increases during World War II, or perhaps World War I or something. But what we had was an increase in revenue of about $1 trillion in superstar firm, relatively small group of companies. I think Amazon alone was over $100 million. And that is an increase in revenue in 1 year's time. That is just stunning. The amount of market share, if you think about the impact on thousands of other companies that gave up that revenue, especially direct competitors and in the industries that they're moving into, that gives you an idea of what you're faced with in this network economy when you start applying intelligent systems across the entire enterprise. And so I'm going to leave that up so that it can sink in here while we're talking about this. So confusing ML and DL projects, while the companies that are the superstar firms that are doing really well have a lot of projects, but they're done on top of data management, good data management systems. And that's really the differentiating factor. None of them, to my awareness, has a KOS across the entire enterprise like we do, but they have it over significant portions of their enterprise. And those are the areas where they're seeing productivity and they're focusing their growth on those areas. For assuming big is better, that's one of the big problems that we run into. this gets into what I call the IT commoditization paradox. And realized this a long time ago. Leading computer scientists have been aware of it a long time. It gets a little bit into culture and politics, where a lot of people think that commoditization is good because it allows you to provide much cheaper products. And that's the paradox. It does provide much cheaper products because it's scaled very high. That was sort of the idea behind, Microsoft, is that it was very inexpensive for them to replicate because it's just digital code. They could do it for next to nothing. So it was a beautiful model, business model, very profitable. And, it's scaled across the world. The problem is that it doesn't provide, once it's scaled out, it provides no competitive advantage at all. It's just increased costs. So you're spending more to stay in the same place. And that's what we're beginning to see in AI systems with higher redundancy. You can't get a competitive advantage with any product that is available to all your competitors worldwide, obviously. So the challenge is sort of like a middleware deal, right? And that's where our KOS comes in, is that for a few years time, you're better off, and that's at the conclusion of this paper, is historically, if you're an incumbent organization, you're much better off adopting startups, specialized products that provide a competitive advantage for the first decade of adoption. And that's where the competitive advantage will be. Now, you can do it internally, and generally speaking, it's a mix of both, right? So most large organizations, it's not buy versus build, it's a combination of both. Finding the best systems, reducing the amount of redundancy and waste. But that big is better is really a problem. Another issue that's really come to the forefront in the past couple of years has been the existential risk in the commoditized IT companies. And we've seen that. There's a link here to it, but there's no need for most people to go into all of those details. But basically what you have is you have these infrastructure providers that dominate, let's say, finance, and then they dominate military, and then they dominate intelligence. Potentially one hacker, one really good supply chain hack could take the whole system down. And that is just foolish. From a risk management perspective, it's unacceptable levels of risk. So that's one of the reasons why we designed the KOS in a multi-cloud architecture, because I don't want my customers, knowing what I know, to be in a position of existential risk. And we also take preparations in our own in the KOS that I can't get into details on, the security aspect of it, to avoid that problem. And so if your main cloud computer company goes down, infrastructure provider goes down for some reason, then we can quickly move over to another cloud provider for the KOS aspect of that business, which is essentially your human workforce, and it can be extended supply chain and ecosystem. So it's critically important. And corporate data center or our own smaller customized data centers. So the combination of factors there, assuming big is better, that's one of the biggest problems. And frankly, it's just a false myth. It's just not true. Failure to operationalize is number 5. There's been surveys by a bunch of companies here, Lake McKinsey and IBM, and there's others. I found the same thing in our direct experience, is that in all these projects that everybody was, you need to learn and do this and do these experiments, very few of them are operationalized over the years. Now, it's not all negative. One of the things that happened during that learning process is that organizations found that they found their internal strengths and weaknesses. Again, this goes back to, finding the right partners and specialists. No organization in the world has it all internally. Sure, the big ones, spend billions of dollars a year on IT budgets, you can function, but nobody has, otherwise you wouldn't see the largest tech companies in the world with these giant ecosystems. They obviously don't think they have it all in-house, and frankly, they don't. They need to leverage the best the world has to offer. So this is one of the problems with ML projects. So as they learn they don't have the capabilities and the tech matures, a lot of organizations have been waiting for systems like our KOS to mature and become available before they operationalize across the enterprise. They realize that they don't have what it takes to do it all in-house. So one of the things in the article that you'll see is, again, the KLO, those that know me and know KYield, the goal of our system is a continuously adaptive learning organization, or a KLO. And there's a nice little graphic here. And that is what you're seeing in the superstar firms. That's essentially, now nobody's perfect. There's no organization that's perfect, but the percentage or the level that they achieve of a KLO determines their outcome. And when you have a enterprise data management system in place, highly intelligent with good data physics that can extract in a secure way with data, protecting privacy and protecting security issues, intelligence across your network, and incentivize employees. This is not something you're not stealing from them, you're not spying on them. The idea is to make every person, achieve their potential and help each worker achieve their goals, and each business unit, each team, each organization. As you do that and you reach a KLO, let's say you're reaching 70% of your potential versus others, like here, the laggards. As you can see, the laggards are, probably going out of business. They probably won't last this decade, on the chart, nearly a decade. They probably won't even survive. When you don't have a KLO, if your KLO is, you're only learning from, 25% of your errors. And this is troubling, because as a society, we're not learning from our lessons, and we're not acting on it. So our KLO, our DMS actually provides actions, and follow up, make sure that the actions from those lessons learned are taking place. Really, really important. And again, this is sort of goes without saying for data folks, but no individual, no group of individuals has the ability to even visualize, manage the scale of information out there without really smart systems in place. So that's primarily what this is about, is optimizing the information available, the intelligence available from the source, very high quality precision data, running state-of-the-art algorithms on top of it on a continuous basis. And if you do that, you do it well, all other things being considered, you'll be able to compete with anybody in the world. And they'll have a very difficult time competing with you. Of course, we all know that all other things are not created equal. There's still locations matter. There's still market share, market power, regulatory capture. There's a lot of other issues out there that affect the outcomes. But in terms of what you can do about and the things that you can do something about and relatively easily, I think this is probably the best that you can do. So number 6, redundancy is prevalent. I talked about that. I won't mention any names, but one very large organization working through the CEO that we dealt with for months. They had an internal team that, they predetermined that they weren't going to work with any external vendor. They're going to do it all in-house, no matter what, basically. Doesn't matter about ROI, doesn't matter about redundancy, doesn't matter. And what was amazing is that you have a CEO that has a very stellar reputation, great track record, and he didn't overrule. In this case, it was the tech folks that made that decision. Now, this case, they have a giant budget. They've done pretty well, but my estimation is that they're burning about 40% of their budget. So several $100 million a year, 40% of that is waste. So it doesn't make any sense. And I told the CEO that this is not a business. This goes back to the cultural issue, right? and not invented here syndrome and all the rest. You're better off checking your ego at the door and just saying, look, we're not the best in the world at everything. We're never going to be. That's a sort of, in redundancy is essentially business 101. And this is a very strong business I'm talking about. And most of these that are, this is what happens in generational. Same thing happened, at the desktop operating systems and the productivity suites. There were a bunch of companies trying to do, internal custom things. It makes no sense whatsoever to do the universal issues for every organization to be wasting money on it. It's crazy. So 7, top tier talent is scarce. It's very well known that we have a talent war at the AI scientists. In many cases, the individual AI scientists, a handful of companies that are trying to dominate the top tier of the science and AI worldwide, been pretty effective at it. Not, they're not as good as they think they are, because it's some specialties are better than others. But basically, what I'm arguing in the paper here is that those are, most people don't realize, those are specialists in deep learning, genetic algorithms. They're not AI systems. So what's even more rare are when you have a combination, especially at the CEO level, a top tier level, understanding of data physics, algorithmics, AI systems, their own business and their own market environment. And you put all of those things together, that's even more rare. So there's a worse talent war for that. However, in these cases, they're paying individual AI scientists more than the average business is spending for their entire budget. So it's made sense for a few that have multi-billion-dollar budgets, but the point here is that it's physically impossible for all but a handful of companies to compete in top tier talent, right? And there's a lot of open source. You can benefit from it. You can do that, but without that, AI systems, refined AI systems, allows you to tap into some of the top tier AI talent in the world and encode it in the system, right? And semi-automated. That's how you're going to do it. That's how you're going to compete. Otherwise, if you're leaving up to just projects and individuals, I know most of them. I followed the work of most of them for years. You're just not going to be able to compete. Ain't going to happen. So this is the best that you could do. Fortunately, it's more efficient, and you can actually outproduce a lot of those top tier AI scientists, because really it boils down to is engineering and efficiency in terms of economics and competitiveness. So number 8, not invented here syndrome, NIH, very common, not altogether bad. It's good to have pride. It's good to have some other things. But but in the AI market, enterprise AI market, not invented here syndrome is why we're running into so many of these, and protectionists. There's a lot of turf protection, frankly. But when you're doing all these projects and all these experiments and they're not being operationalized because the senior executives in the organization are saying, look, I'm not happy with it. This is not something I'm going to get behind. I don't think we have the ability to compete. Should we, are we being redundant? Are we wasting money? Or should we, work with specialists that have already refined these systems and learned these lessons? The not invented here syndrome is damaging, and it's sort of keeping a lot of organizations in a rut. Now, keep in mind, if this ROI doesn't improve in the vast majority, what I'm concerned about is they're going to cut back on their budgets. They're going to lay off their data scientists and all these folks doing these projects. And this chart that you're looking at, hopefully, is going to be more dramatic. So the superstar firms are going to be more vertical. The laggards are going to be more, downward trend. Look, the economy is not sustainable in that way. We're going to have civil unrest, civil wars potentially. That is not going to work, and you're not going to convince a majority of people to go on public welfare, right? So I'm saying, my argument on this private calls. Let's be smart about this. Let's have more dynamic competitive markets. Let's use AI systems to improve the world, improve markets, and avoid to the extent that we can unnecessary wars and that sort of thing, crises. So number 9, poorly designed data management system pre-optimized for AI. Okay, this goes back to the DMS thing that I'm talking about. It's physically impossible to compete. You can't do any of the functions. You can do them in a finite way. You can do prevention, but you're not going to be able to prevent crises. You're not going to be able to provide security across your enterprise. You're not going to be able to accelerate R&D or enhance productivity for your workforce unless you have one of the world's best data management systems in place. And there are very few of them. Ours is the only one, to my awareness, that is truly enterprise-wide, catered to each individual's needs. So in the past 5 years, we've had an increase. The revenue growth in AI systems has been consulting, data wrangling, data management, labeling, cleaning data, a lot of labor-intensive stuff. There has been, the cloud infrastructure has done really well. That's been, the most profitable area. The primary, the top 3 leaders, especially the top 2, have gained most of that. And strategy and consulting sessions. That's where the majority, and then of course, chips, things, specialized chips. But look at the outcome. ROIs are not where they need to be for the majority. So that's what, and then the tech maturity systems have been refined like ours. They're technically viable and scalable to run your whole enterprise on and compete. I think that's why IDG and Gartner and others are looking to the future, saying, look, the growth is going to be in systems, platforms, systems, specialized chips, much more efficient systems. And that's where most of the ROI is going to be found. You're not going to be, bottom line is you're going to be forced to adopt, or you get left behind. You won't be able to, and that's what happens in these major. I don't know of another generational change in technology that is more profound than AI systems. I don't think there has been. We compare it to electricity, we compare it to other things, but based on what I know about this, as it matures, I just don't think, our other system is this synthetic genius machine over the last 10 years. I spent a lot of my R&D time on that. And that's a super intelligence as a service based on the smartest humans that have ever lived. I just don't know that you're going to be able to compete against that sort of brain power. So number 10, 3 little bear budgets. We often find ourselves comparing Goldilocks fairy tale to AI budgets, right? And there's a handful that are wasting billions. Things like autonomous vehicles, there's no ROI yet, and really not in the foreseeable future. There is a lot of ROI, however, in the auto industry, on what me and others have been saying all along. Look, you could use this technology to augment, which is what we do in the enterprise, and make these cars safer, right? Make them a lot safer, make them more efficient, make them more enjoyable. And so that's essentially augmentation, semi-automated and automated. And those companies are doing real well. They're profitable. A lot of them are doing really well. They're growing really fast. But the pure, the moonshots are pure semi or autonomous, fully autonomous level 5 is still a long way off and spent, I don't know, hundreds of billions of dollars have been committed. I don't know how much has actually been spent, but it's a huge number. And so those may, if autonomous vehicles, those dollars won't be wasted, and the productivity is going to be off the charts if they can achieve it and get regulators to approve it, customers to adopt it. However, the vast majority are under, they're under investing. And so there's this smaller segment sort of in between that's, the 3 little bears, the Goldilocks, that gets it just right, right? And their budget. There's a pretty small amount, and basically those that are, doing the right mix of finding the right external partners with the right internal talent. And I think in the future, you'll see that these are AI systems. So the most common error that we find is failure to invest in the refined DMS. Now, the problem with this is that in our case, the KOS, 10, 12 years ago, the US Army was the first large customer that we talked to. Actually, there was one other one that was a potential partner. It was a tech company. And we talked to them about being a customer and a potential partner. And this was the OEM stage, right? It was still R&D stage. Wasn't technically viable, but I was sure that we could do it. Then we talked to the US Army, and we're talking about a pilot for the US Army and what would it cost. And at that point, a large scale pilot would have been over $100 million. We didn't convince them to do it, obviously, but it would have required supercomputers, and it didn't do the things that it wasn't until 2012 that we demonstrated the data was technically viable on one of the biggest financial markets through a mutual vendor. It wasn't really until 2014, 2015 that you started to see some of the functionality on the laptops, and it was later that you get to the phones. And those are really important for us in the use cases that we want to get to. So it's taken all this time to get technically viable and refined and that sort of thing. But if you don't, the cost now, because of tens of billions of dollars invested in components, especially like hardware, and then some of we do use, take advantage of some of the open source in our tech stack. But now, because of the investment of time and energy by us internally and externally, we can do the same project for single-digit millions. Now, mind you, this is not across the whole Army. This was just a large pilot. But most, or let's say if you're a mid-market company, mid-market, in the low hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and you're worried about competing in the future or just improving operations and becoming more competitive, more look into the future, we can do it in the single-digit millions. You can install a basic KOS to be able to do that. And so that's how, it's come down that much, more than 10 times. And that's the good. Then it's a factor of, how big is your organization? Are you going to extend it to your partner's ecosystem? Are they going to share in the cost? There's a lot of other factors that go in. But we do incentivize, because of the R&D and the science is really demonstrated to me, you're going to need these systems to survive and thrive. You need to get to every employee in the organization. If you don't, it's one of those unfortunate situations where it may be a frontline worker, a retail worker, maybe a janitor, somebody working in the back house, maybe an accountant seeing something. Anyone you leave out on the highest ROI possible is in prevention, and they may see something, and we make it very easy and we automate it for them to submit a red flag, a potential red flag. We encourage organizations to provide a good financial incentive for them to do so. But for example, that janitor might see, and the one that I used in a talk recently, remember the condominium that collapsed in Florida a while back? Well, about the day or two before I was doing this talk I asked a global organization for enterprise or IT architects. And they had I saw it on LinkedIn. There was a swimming pool supplier that happened to be going, or a maintenance operation that stopped by to work on the pool in that condominium. And they saw damage in the foundation and took a picture. It's like only a couple of days before it collapsed. That's a great case study, a good example of what I'm talking about. I've seen these in over my career many times, studied most of the large crises. So we make it in our system very easy. It can be a photo, it can be a text, it doesn't matter, multimedia. It can be a scanned document if they see something in accounting or whatever. But and then, alert the right people. But that's just one of the advances that took many, many years to figure out, and to, really refine it. Now I'm convinced that we have a whole program called HUMCAT that is, prevention of human caused catastrophes or enabled. And I'm convinced that with the system in place installed, we can prevent most of them. Some of the corporate events have cost over $50 billion that were preventable, that we've studied. So why on earth any corporation would risk that kind of loss and not for, a few $1 million install? And by the way, we might even be able to provide financing through partners to do it because it lowers your risk profile. So the last thing that I want to have on here after number 10 in the article that I want to talk about is, again, our EAI, Enterprise AI Principles. At the first of the year, we released our 15 EAI principles, and then followed that up with a 3-part video interview with Dr. Rob Nielsen on our board, who has a lot of experience in this. He was a department chair at a university, National Defense University, and then he was a CKO at the U.S. Army for a few years as a civilian. And he's also our longest running board member because Russell Borland, he was my partner originally, passed away in 2010 unexpectedly. Rob has been with us the longest since, and he does a good job on these interviews. So he interviewed me, and we go through the, complete with implications and rationale of each principle. And that's also on our website. So I just wanted to mention that. So in conclusion, obstacles to adoption of competitive AI systems are primarily psychological and cultural, but they are no less damaging than structural or physical obstacles, and they can be disastrous even for market leaders. Indeed, they can be fatal. I'm in the process of seeing companies, observing them from afar, and I can see that they are in deeper and deeper trouble because of some of these obstacles, and their competitors do not have these obstacles. That's how important it is. We're just seeing, it's creative destruction right before our very eyes, and it's preventable. These obstacles can be overcome. So they must be overcome because you're going to need these systems to survive and thrive in the future. And if you just adopt again, the commodities, the paradox of the commoditized IT, you're not going to get any competitive advantage. That's fine if you're, I suppose, if you're a market leader and you don't want any more market share and you're fine where you are, you just want to protect your turf, and you think that commoditized IT is going to do it for you, in addition to your own internal custom stuff. But I can tell you there are market leaders that are in trouble. And so I think that's a foolish error that will come back to haunt the legacy of the management teams and the future of those organizations. So one last thing here is that CEOs and boards may want to go back and review the history of generational change in technology. This goes to the big is better, which is a false myth. And you'll see throughout history that favors incumbents who partner with emerging leaders that can provide a competitive advantage through that first decade of adoption. And I think you'll find that every generational change in technology, that's true. So it's not so much as being an early adopter, we're already beyond that stage now, in my view, but becoming really a smart adopter. When to get in, right? You want to wait until they're refined, especially if you're a large organization, so you don't want to take too much risk, but you don't want to be a follower in this. You want to be a leader for sure. At the very least, you may not be a superstar, but if you can achieve this leadership and then have other advantages in your product mix or physical, maybe financial advantages, then at least you can fend off the superstars and maintain your existing place, even if you're not growing. So I'll stop it there. And thank you for your time and interest. Again, this article, top 10 obstacles to successful enterprise AI, top of our website. find it on LinkedIn, or the best way to do it is probably just to go to Cognitive World, find the link on our website, because that's the best format. It has the visuals. So thanks for your time. Have a great day.